What's up, guys? This is Kelowna's Cougar Meat Kid Colin Cutler for the World of Great podcast, and today's video, bias be damned, I am doing a video on the Bernie Sanders smear. That's right, it's February 2nd, 2020. We are one day away from the Iowa caucus, and the race is pretty crazy in the Democratic primary in the United States right now. I'm up here in Canada just eating popcorn, watching the show. The last poll that I looked at, which was from Politico today, Biden and Sanders are in a dead tie in the polls for Iowa. So tomorrow's going to be quite interesting. You got Mike Bloomberg coming up in the polls. He should be taking some votes away from Biden and maybe Klobuchar. But you have Warren still in the race as well. She would take votes away from Bernie, as would Andrew Yang. So it's a pretty interesting race right now. The Iowa caucus, you have a lot of debate happening right now as all the different caucuses, I don't know if that's how you word it, are kind of arguing their points of why Bernie or whoever their candidate is should get the delegate votes. But what I want to talk about today is kind of what I predicted all along. So, just as a reminder, my original prediction when we talked about the impeachment trial was that nothing would happen in the impeachment. Trump would get acquitted, which is what it looks like we're getting to with the vote going against calling any witnesses, which in about 40 minutes, I will be doing a live stream called Democracy Is Democracy Dead, which will happen before you see this video. So I don't know why I mentioned that. Um, so my prediction was that Trump would get acquitted. It would help him in the approval ratings, and then the Bernie smears would put Biden through the primary, and with another non-progressive candidate like Biden, another Hillary 2.0, you'd have a lower voter turnout, and we know historically that lower voter turnouts favor Republicans. So, still my prediction, and it looks like we are on our way. That all being said, Bernie jumped a little bit in the polls about a month ago, and mainstream media decided it's time to go nuclear on the Bernie smears. So today I am sharing 7 Bernie smears, which will sound a little bit like clickbait in the title because it's 6 Bernie smears and one kind of smear, kind of true article that is also biased towards corporate neoliberal Democrats, which well, I'll explain now. Hopefully, Pete can edit out some of my bullshit here. It's the whole point of having a producer, but we'll see how this goes. All right. So, Bernie smear number 1 comes from the Elizabeth Warren camp. This happened, I believe, about 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, and ironically actually helped Bernie in the polls. So, during the Iowa debates, let's go back a little bit. Before the Iowa debates, the Elizabeth Warren campaign hinted to a conversation, a private conversation that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders had in 2018 about who could beat Trump in the general election in 2020. The Elizabeth Warren camp hinted to a comment of Bernie Sanders saying that he thinks a woman cannot become president, cannot win the election and become president. So the Elizabeth Warren camp leaked this and insinuated that this was the case. Elizabeth Warren did not deny this right away. She did not clear up the allegations. She did not make clear what was actually said. She let the perception that Bernie Sanders said something sexist, that a woman couldn't become president, she let that go to try to help herself from the polls, and she got destroyed. So Bernie Sanders obviously denied this, and then everybody that supports Bernie, and even people that maybe didn't support Bernie but just knew it was horseshit, came online and started going through Bernie's history. So his consistency of fighting for women's rights, being arrested and protesting for both women and rights of African Americans. There's a video of Bernie Sanders being arrested in, I think, the 70s, but I could be wrong there. Being arrested while chained to 2 African American women while fighting for civil rights of both African Americans and women as well. So pretty silly there. He's also on film camera on TV saying exactly that. He thinks a woman could become president. There's also video of him, again, I believe it's from either the 60s or 70s when he was, I think when he was mayor, but you can fact check me on that, but he's talking to a group of kids at a school who are about 10, and he specifically is talking to the young girls in the room and trying to encourage them to get more involved in politics, saying that we don't have enough women in politics or in Congress or in the Senate, and that you as the young girl could become part of that process. So pretty silly that you paint Bernie Sanders as a sexist when he's fought for women's rights his entire life and has been super consistent. So obviously he got annihilated online, Elizabeth Warren got annihilated online for these comments, with some people calling her a snake and saying that she backstabbed her friend. She's kind of backtracked a little bit, because right after that happened, Bernie Sanders jumped in the polls and Elizabeth Warren tanked in the polls. She's recovered a tiny bit since then. She's dropped down to like the 10 to 15% mark in a lot of different polls, in a lot of different caucuses. Again, I'm not sure if caucuses is even a word, but I'm new to politics. So that smear did not help Elizabeth Warren and actually helped Bernie Sanders. So that's one down. Number 2, Washington Post article, which, by the way, Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, who Bernie Sanders is trying to get to pay his fair share in taxes, because Amazon paid 0 in federal taxes last year, even though Jeff Bezos is the richest man in the world with like $150 billion or whatever he's at now. It's probably changed since I just said that. So this article was comparing... I really should have wrote the name of the article down. Actually, I have it here. Washington Post, Bernie Sanders supporters have weaponized Facebook to spread angry memes about his Democratic rivals. Ooh, so this is not actually going after the Bernie Sanders camp itself. It's going after Bernie supporters online. So if you read through this article, not only do they compare the memes being shared to Russian bots, which is hilarious. Basically what these memes is people that were upset with Elizabeth Warren trying to smear Bernie Sanders. The biggest one that they talk about in this article is a picture of Elizabeth Warren's face as a mask being pulled off of Hillary Clinton's face. So basically saying that she's Hillary Clinton 2.0. The other thing they talk about is Bernie Bros. That's what they call them, Bernie Bros, which is hilarious again, because I think what they're trying to insinuate is that all Bernie supporters are like douchey white dudes, even though he has a huge following by minorities and people of color and young people and women. So the Bernie Bros thing is already kind of funny on the face of it. But some people had put a snake emoji in comments of Elizabeth Warren. So I guess you can't put a snake emoji when someone's being a snake. So let's be clear here. Elizabeth Warren is being somewhat snake-like as a politician, and she is starting to backtrack on a lot of things. She was all for Bernie's Medicare for All plan, and then she's backtracked on that. And now she's trying to smear Bernie and call him a sexist. So you really can't blame people for feeling this way. But this article is basically attacking people that are passionate and saying that they're dangerous and this is going to hurt the Democratic Party. But let's also remember that this loyalty of base and frustration of a base is a big reason why Trump won the election in 2016, because of his base and people being upset with the status quo. Whether or not he has delivered on all those anti-status quo policies is a whole nother podcast and debate that we can have. But to say that this is going to hurt Bernie in the election, I would disagree with that. I think a fired up base is what's actually helping Bernie, and the more of these smears that come up, I think it actually helps Bernie. So yeah, I mean, again, like I've said this whole time in my prediction, if you're going to put somebody in like an Elizabeth Warren that people perceive as a Hillary 2.0, people aren't going to come out to the polls, and Republicans are going to do very well. So pretty interesting, basically, this whole article, because people are calling her a snake and a backstabber, which she kind of is. So maybe I'm just part of the Bernie bros. One thing in this article, just real quick, that I actually do agree with, just because this is the world of gray and we got to keep it there, is there's a quote saying algorithms aggregate people and accentuate extremism, which I somewhat agree with. I do think that it's pretty easy to divide people with algorithms, and once people do start getting upset, it's easy to just see a lot of that negativity and that algorithm echo chamber spiral. So I'm not saying that Bernie's base couldn't get riled up and that algorithms won't accentuate the worst parts of that. It's definitely something that's in the realm of possibility, but I also believe people have every right to be passionate about the candidate that they believe in and to be passionate against candidates that they think are against the interests of the majority of the American people. So I think it's pretty silly to write an entire article just because this base does not support this wish-washiness that Elizabeth Warren, is participating in or is acting. Okay. There's one other thing in this article that was saying that Facebook users. Oh yeah. Okay. So I was doing this research last night. So there was an analysis that this website did where they were saying the amount of participation of the Bernie supporters with these memes. So they found the data of like all the memes that were out and shared and kind of all the activity within these echo chambers of Bernie supporters releasing these memes or whatever. They're saying it's unproportionate to where Bernie support is in the polls, meaning that there's way more activity within these negative memes, if that's what you want to call them, compared to how much support he has. So what they're trying to argue is that this gives Facebook users, as in Bernie Sanders' campaign, a disproportionate discourse to authority at the ballot box. I guess meaning that they have more power of influencing people than what the support shows in the polls. So whether or not that's a good thing or not, we'll see. Especially when you get guys like Bloomberg that are just putting money into campaigns. If he's able to influence people based off paying for whatever advertisement shares and funneling people to his content, I think that is a bit of an issue when it comes to democracy. But we will see. Also, just one last thing on this Washington Post article, which I actually kind of stumbled upon when I was looking at different Bernie smears, so I didn't actually mean to find this one, but it's just full of juicy stuff. They were basically trying to hint, and go ahead and read the article, but they were trying to hint that the election is, I guess by Russia, I don't know, is being rigged to help Bernie win, which hopefully by the end of this video you will disagree with immensely. The fact that anyone thinks that the primary is rigged to help Bernie Sanders is either lying or needs to check themselves. So pretty darn funny. And then I wrote a little side note out because as I was reading this Washington Post article, there was a little video in my bottom right corner that was it was a non-audio pop-up video showing Elizabeth Warren snubbing Bernie Sanders at the Iowa debates, saying, "Oh, I think you called me a liar," and you can look up that video; it's everywhere. She snubs him when Bernie Sanders goes for the handshake, and then the video goes on to show pretty much every candidate but Bernie Sanders doing little rallies. To be fair, obviously I just read the article and moved on, so maybe they showed Bernie Sanders at some point, but not in like the 10-15 minutes, well, 10 minutes that I was reading and making notes of that article. So and then, sorry, I know I keep saying last part, but there is one more good thing in my notes for this video. In the article, they were calling it a tactic by Bernie Sanders supporters, sharing these memes. A tactic by Bernie Sanders supporters, thinking that, it's a calculated, cerebral attack by all these Bernie supporters to help Bernie in the election, which I think people are just actually sharing this out of frustration, just like any Trump supporters do. They just share things, whether or not they think about the validity of the post. It's a whole nother conversation. But then they also admit that these shared memes have absolutely nothing to do with the Sanders campaign, and they're not influencing this, and they're not promoting it, and or anything like that. So they admit that at the end has nothing to do with Bernie Sanders campaign. So who you're trying to smear, who knows? So that was an amazing article if you want to read something pretty darn entertaining. So number 3, we're getting right along here. Hillary Clinton saying nobody likes Bernie. This is a Hollywood Reporter interview. Nobody likes Bernie and nobody wants to work with Bernie. So I would disagree that nobody likes Bernie because he's leading in the polls. So the people like Bernie. He's got a giant movement. He has the most donations out of any president in history when it comes to individual donors. And he brought in more actual dollars than any other primary candidate. And what she means, though, is nobody in the Senate or House or whatever likes Bernie, which, again, not necessarily true, but you have a lot of neoliberal agenda politicians in the House and the Senate. So yeah, of course, a lot of them don't like Bernie because he's anti-establishment and doesn't help their donors. So no surprise there. Again, so number 4 now, Washington Post. There's an article, just real quick. It was saying Bernie Sanders is insanely consistent. That's nothing to brag about. That's an actual article saying that it's not good that Bernie Sanders is really consistent. I guess hinting towards that if you're consistent, you're not growing. Bernie Sanders is consistent because he's for the people, wants to help the people, and all the things he wants to see change have not happened in all the years he's been in politics, which has been since like the 60s or whatever. So that one's just hilarious on the face of it. Number 5, the Joe Rogan endorsement fiasco. If you haven't heard about this, Joe Rogan didn't even do an official endorsement for Bernie Sanders. I believe this was a podcast where he was talking to Jimmy Dore, who has an amazing YouTube channel. He's a comedian, political analyst, and I absolutely love listening to Jimmy Dore, not only because he's funny, but he gives you better information than any mainstream media, and he always jokes that he's a jack-off comedian, and he can provide news better than anybody else. But basically what happened was Jimmy Dore was trying to say Joe Rogan's not like meanly, but saying, oh, you probably vote right wing or whatever. And Joe Rogan said, no, I've never voted right wing in my life. If anything, he voted for Jill Stein, I'm pretty sure. If anything, he's progressive. And that was kind of the joke. And at some point he said, I'm probably going to vote for Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders then took that quote and used it as an endorsement. And then this is kind of goes along with the video we made before, is the left eating itself. So then all the extreme left started getting upset with the Sanders campaign because they're saying Joe Rogan is sexist and against trans rights. Now, I'm not here to promote what Joe Rogan has said about the trans community, but I will say that I feel like it's a bit out of context. I think what he brought up is something that should be a bigger debate, and that is, should transitioning male to females be allowed to compete in MMA? Is there like a time that they should have the hormone replacement? Like, who knows, right? But that's a bigger debate, and I don't think cherry picking that one little quote and then accentuating it means necessarily that he's like a sexist and bigot. And if you listen to Joe Rogan regularly, he is, one of the kindest people that really wants just to see everybody get along, right? And yeah, sure, he says things that he probably wishes he worded different, as we all do. He's not perfect. It's not the point of his podcast, it's to be perfect. He even admitted that he should have worded it differently. But remember, he's also a comedian and says some extreme things. So to jump on Bernie for just showing an endorsement, like Joe Rogan is supporting Bernie. He has the biggest platform out of any podcaster out there. This is a good thing for the Bernie campaign. You don't have to agree on everything, but if we can agree on the main context of what Bernie Sanders' platform is, I think it's really important to get as much of that support as possible, especially at this time. So I think if you see Biden go through the primaries, this is going to be a big reason for it. That all being said, I think the people that watch Joe Rogan that are going to then support Bernie are not going to be fazed by this at all. So I think overall this is actually going to help Bernie Sanders. Number 6, and we're getting there. So there's a Fox News article on MSNBC's Chris Matthews. I'm not going to pull the article up. They I watched the actual segment of this. Chris Matthews was talking to the MSNBC panel, and he was trying to say at this point you have to think about which candidate is likely to pull over and help you when your car is broken down on the side of the road. And Bernie Sanders is not the one that's going to pull over on the side of the road to help you out. The most hilarious part of this is if you listen to the Rational National, I forget his name, but he's a YouTuber that I watch quite often, political analyst from Canada. He does a piece on this, which is very eloquently done and very articulate, where he finds an old news segment of a girl talking about how she broke down on the highway, and Senator Sanders, this is years ago, Senator Sanders pulled over to help her out because he was worried about her being broken down on the highway because she was out of her car. He was worried about her safety. So this is the Orwellian world that we live in, where someone is making up this really thin reason, this imaginary hypothetical that doesn't even really make sense of why you shouldn't vote for Bernie Sanders. He wouldn't pull over to help you if you were broken down on the highway. And there's literally a case, a moment in time when Bernie Sanders pulled over to help. So they're literally making shit up, and it's not even true. So this, out of all the smears, is my absolute favorite because it's just reaching for things. It's not even based in anything. I was gonna say it's not even based in reality, but it is based in reality. It's a lie when you base it in reality, because Bernie Sanders actually did pull over to help somebody out. And you don't even need that evidence. If you don't think Bernie Sanders is gonna pull over and help you on the side of the road, like, you're out to lunch. He wants to help an entire nation get health care. I will give one of the anchors credit. He disagreed when that was said, and then the original Chris Matthews just lost his mind about it. So pretty interesting. All right, number 7. So this one isn't necessarily a spear, a smear. Why do I keep saying spear? Let's try that again. Number 7. This one's not necessarily a smear. This is an article titled "Never Bernie Apocalypse." The Never Bernie Apocalypse is Coming, I believe is what it's called. And this is actually kind of the whole point of this video. So it's not really a smear. It's actually quite true. But this is from the New York Post, and they are quite biased in this. If you read this article, they refer to Bernie Sanders only as a socialist, not a democratic socialist. They don't make the distinction. They, at one point, call him a card-carrying socialist, I guess comparing him to Stalin and some other things. They don't even talk about how he's an independent in Vermont, an independent senator in Vermont. So they never use any of those terms, only socialist. And the most amazing part of this is that they call the Never Bernie campaign that's just starting grassroots. So they say at this point it's just grassroots. Okay, so the Never Bernie apocalypse, the Never Bernie campaign is only going to be from corporate Democrats or people that, or centrist-leaning followers that then read these articles and then parrot the talking points. But to call the anti-Bernie campaign, the Never Bernie campaign, grassroots, to me is amazing. Absolutely amazing. And I've been calling a lot of things Orwellian these days because, man, we're in some interesting times where nothing really makes sense. So, oh yes. So those are my 7 Bernie Sanders smears. Technically 6 smears and an article that basically told the truth, but with their own biases, calling Bernie Sanders a socialist. But one thing that's interesting when I was looking this up, like I said before, I actually found smears by accident, not when I was looking for the ones that I already knew about, trying to get more details, more just kept popping up. But if you just Google Bernie Sanders, it's a really interesting scroll as you go through all the different articles smearing Bernie Sanders, and then just articles about what the polls are, where Bernie's ahead. So it's literally just a rolling, alternating scroll of anti-Bernie Sanders, Bernie Sanders leading the poll. Anti-Bernie Sanders, Bernie leading the, or tied or close or whatever it is. So I found that really interesting. So I hope you enjoyed those 7 smears of Bernie Sanders. Got a little bit of information out of that. My takeaway from reading through all these Bernie Sanders smears is basically that the prediction I made earlier that Bernie Sanders would be smeared out of the primary is going to happen. The DNC is already changing rules so that Bloomberg can get into the next Democratic debates, which he's not supposed to because he doesn't have actual individual donors, which was the original rule. So because he's got, I think he's in double digits in the poll. They saying that he should be allowed in to the debates because he has some sort of ranking in the poll. So he's literally buying his way into the debates, which is pretty amazing. So when you factor in all these things, rule changes by the DNC because they don't want Bernie Sanders in they don't want him to win the primary, and then all the smears that are happening, and they're just going to ramp up, especially if Bernie Sanders wins Iowa or is close to it. So I really think these smears, even though some of them are helping Bernie Sanders, I think you just have to convince enough people that are on the fence to flip to Joe Biden. And I really want Bernie Sanders to win the primary. Again, I'm Canadian, so I don't really have a dog in the fight. But morally and philosophically, I align with Bernie more than any other candidate that I've ever read about. So I want Bernie to win, but my takeaway is my prediction will be right. These smears will work. Biden will go through the primaries. People are going to stay home, and you are going to see Trump be reelected in 2020. Thank you for joining me for the 7 smears of Bernie Sanders. I am Kelowna's Cougar Meat Kid Colin Cutler for the World Podcast. Have a great day. Peace and love.